Months passed, and Maplewood began to feel different. The protests had quieted down, but their impact lingered in the air like the scent of fresh rain after a storm. Conversations about racial profiling, police accountability, and community trust became part of everyday life, not just in whispered tones, but openly at dinner tables, school meetings, and town halls. People who had once avoided discussing such topics now embraced them with urgency and determination. Change was slow, but it was happening, and Ms. Eve's story remained at the heart of it all. Officer Greg Miller kept his promise. He worked tirelessly within the police department to push for reforms, often facing resistance from colleagues who dismissed his ideas as unnecessary or overly idealistic. But he persisted, drawing strength from the memory of Ms. Eve's unwavering resilience. Training programs focused on cultural sensitivity were introduced, along with stricter guidelines for handling anonymous tips and conducting searches. Officers were encouraged to engage more deeply with the communities they served, attending neighborhood events and listening to residents' concerns without judgment. Miller also became a vocal advocate outside the department, speaking at conferences and workshops about the importance of accountability in law enforcement. His speeches always included a personal note about Ms. Eve, how she had shaped his life, and how her wrongful arrest had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths. "We can't keep making excuses," he would say, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "Every badge we wear comes with a responsibility to protect, to serve, and to do better." The community noticed his efforts. While some remained skeptical, others began to see him as an ally rather than an adversary. At one neighborhood meeting, a young boy approached Miller shyly, holding out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a drawing of a police officer shaking hands with a smiling woman labeled Ms. Eve. The boy looked up at Miller and said, "My mom says you're trying to help. I think that's cool." Miller knelt down, thanked the boy, and promised to keep working hard to earn their trust. As for Ms. Eve, she continued living her life, much as she always had, with grace, purpose, and quiet determination. She reopened her tutoring sessions, welcoming children into her home with open arms. Her garden flourished once again, vibrant blooms stretching toward the sun. Though the scars of her ordeal remained, she refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, she channeled her energy into mentoring young people, teaching them not only reading and math, but also lessons about kindness, courage, and standing up for what's right. One Saturday morning, the neighborhood gathered for a special event, a celebration honoring Ms. Eve's contributions to the community. Organized by local leaders and supported by residents of all ages, the event featured speeches, music, and even a mural unveiling. Painted on the side of a nearby building, the mural depicted Ms. Eve surrounded by children, her face glowing with warmth and wisdom. Beneath it were the words, "A beacon of hope." When it was her turn to speak, Ms. Eve stepped onto the small stage, greeted by thunderous applause. For a moment, she simply stood there, taking in the sea of familiar faces before her. Then, with a soft smile, she began to speak. "Thank you all for being here today," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "But this isn't just about me. It's about us, all of us working together to create a better future. We've faced challenges, yes, but we've also shown that we can come together, learn from our mistakes, and grow stronger because of them." Her words resonated deeply, drawing nods and murmurs of agreement from the audience. When she finished speaking, Officer Miller joined her on stage, presenting her with a framed certificate of appreciation from the police department. As he handed it to her, their eyes met briefly, a shared understanding passing between them. They weren't perfect, and the road ahead was still long, but they were moving forward, together. The day ended with laughter, music, and shared meals under the shade of Ms. Eve's beloved garden trees. Children ran around playing games while adults exchanged stories and dreams for the future. In that moment, Maplewood felt whole again, not because everything was perfect, but because its people had chosen hope over despair, unity over division. And so, life went on. The scars of the past remained, but they became reminders, not of pain, but of progress. Ms. Eve's quiet strength had inspired a movement, proving that even in the darkest moments, light could shine through. And though the journey was far from over, one thing was certain: Maplewood would never be the same, and that perhaps was the greatest victory of all. Days turned into weeks, and the uproar over Ms. Eve's wrongful arrest showed no signs of fading. The protests outside the police station grew larger, drawing supporters from neighboring towns and even other states. Community leaders organized marches, town hall meetings, and educational workshops aimed at addressing systemic issues within law enforcement. For many, Ms. Eve's case became a rallying cry, a symbol of both the injustices faced by marginalized communities and the resilience needed to fight back against them. Amidst all the activity, Officer Greg Miller found himself grappling with his role in the unfolding drama. The guilt he carried weighed heavily on him, gnawing at his conscience day and night. He couldn't escape the image of Ms. Eve sitting silently in the squad car, or the way her eyes had pierced through him when she said, "I thought I raised you better." Those words haunted him, replaying in his mind like an endless loop. Determined to make amends, Miller decided to visit Ms. Eve again, not as an officer, but as a man seeking redemption. He arrived at her house one Saturday afternoon, his heart pounding with nerves. When she answered the door, her expression was guarded but not hostile. After a brief hesitation, she invited him inside, gesturing for him to sit in the same living room where their last conversation had taken place. "I didn't think I'd see you again," Ms. Eve said simply, taking the seat across from him. Her tone was calm, though there was a lingering edge of caution in her voice. Miller nodded, wringing his hands together as he struggled to find the right words. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "But I needed to come here, to tell you how sorry I am. What I did, it wasn't just wrong. It was disrespectful. To you, to everything you've done for this community, and to the lessons you taught me." Ms. Eve listened quietly, her gaze steady. When he paused, she leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. "Apologies are important, Gregory, but they're only the first step. Words alone won't fix what happened. Actions will." Miller nodded, feeling the weight of her wisdom. "That's why I'm working on something bigger," he admitted. "I've started talking to my superiors about implementing new training programs that focus on cultural sensitivity, de-escalation tactics, and accountability. I want to make sure no one else has to go through what you did." Ms. Eve raised an eyebrow, skeptical but intrigued. "And do you think they'll listen? Change doesn't happen overnight." "It won't be easy," Miller conceded, "but I have to try. If I don't, then none of this matters. I owe it to you, and to myself, to push for something better." For the first time since the incident, a flicker of warmth returned to Ms. Eve's eyes. She didn't offer outright forgiveness, but she did acknowledge his effort. "You were always a bright student, Gregory, smart enough to learn from your mistakes. Don't waste this." By the time evening fell, news of what had happened in Maplewood had spread far beyond the quiet neighborhood. Social media lit up with posts and videos shared by neighbors who had witnessed the ordeal firsthand. The hashtag #JusticeForMsEve began trending on Twitter, drawing attention from local activists, journalists, and even national news outlets. Screenshots of Ms. Eve's arrest, grainy but powerful, circulated alongside captions calling for accountability. People were outraged, not just because of the wrongful arrest itself, but because it highlighted deeper issues that many communities had been fighting against for years. At the police station, Officer Miller sat alone in his car in the parking lot, staring at his phone as he scrolled through the growing wave of reactions online. Comment after comment accused him and his department of racial profiling, incompetence, and abuse of power. Each post felt like another blow to his already fragile conscience. He knew they weren't wrong. What had started as a routine investigation had spiraled into a public relations nightmare. And worse, a personal reckoning. Inside the station, tensions ran high among the other officers. Some defended Miller and Collins, arguing that they were simply following protocol based on the information they received. Others remained silent, unwilling to take sides, but clearly uncomfortable with how things had played out. Meanwhile, the police chief called an emergency meeting to address the fallout. Facing mounting pressure from city officials and community leaders, the department issued a vague apology stating that mistakes were made during the course of the investigation. But to most people, the statement felt hollow, lacking any real acknowledgement of wrongdoing or concrete steps toward reform. The next morning, protests erupted outside the police station. Dozens of residents gathered, holding signs that read "Protect Elders," "Not Harm Them," and "Accountability Now." Among them were students Ms. Eve had tutored over the years, standing shoulder to shoulder with their parents and grandparents. One young girl held up a handmade poster featuring a crayon drawing of Ms. Eve surrounded by flowers, with the words, "We love you, Ms. Eve," written in bold letters. The sight brought tears to more than a few eyes. Despite the chaos swirling around her, Ms. Eve stayed out of the spotlight. She declined interviews and avoided joining the protests, choosing instead to retreat into the comfort of her home. To her, the attention felt overwhelming, almost suffocating. Friends and neighbors stopped by throughout the day to check on her, bringing food, kind words, and offers of support. While grateful for their concern, Ms. Eve couldn't shake the lingering sense of betrayal. It wasn't just about being arrested. It was about having her dignity stripped away in front of everyone she cared about. As the days passed, the story continued to gain traction. Local news anchors interviewed residents, activists spoke passionately about systemic injustice, and even politicians weighed in, promising investigations and policy changes. Yet, amidst all the noise, one thing became clear. Ms. Eve's case had struck a nerve. Her story resonated deeply with people who had experienced similar injustices or feared they might someday. For Ms. Eve, however, the hardest part wasn't the public outrage or the media frenzy. It was grappling with the fact that someone she once trusted, an officer she helped raise and mentor, had turned against her. Though she appreciated Officer Miller's apology, she struggled to reconcile the compassionate boy she remembered with the man who had cuffed her hands behind her back. In moments of quiet reflection, she wondered if true forgiveness was possible, or if some wounds ran too deep to heal fully. Still, despite everything, Ms. Eve refused to let bitterness consume her. As she watered her garden the following weekend, she reminded herself of the lessons she often taught her students. Life is full of challenges, but resilience and hope can carry us through. And though this chapter of her life had been painful, she believed it could also spark meaningful change for her community and perhaps for others like her across the country. The moment Ms. Eve stepped out of the squad car, the crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and angry murmurs. Some neighbors clapped, relieved to see her freed, while others shouted their disapproval at the officers. The tension in the air was palpable, like a storm waiting to break. Ms. Eve stood quietly, her frail frame silhouetted against the chaos. Her face was a mask of exhaustion and sorrow, the kind that comes not just from being wronged, but from seeing trust shattered. Officer Miller stood nearby, his head bowed as if trying to disappear. He couldn't bring himself to meet Ms. Eve's eyes or the piercing gazes of the people around him. Officer Collins tried to step forward and say something, to explain, to diffuse the situation. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she moved closer to her partner, whispering urgently, "We need to get out of here before this gets worse." But Miller shook his head. This wasn't something he could walk away from. Not yet. Not after realizing how deeply he had failed someone who once meant so much to him. Taking a deep breath, he approached Ms. Eve again, his movements slow and deliberate, as though afraid she might bolt at any second. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the noise of the crowd. "Miss Thompson," he began, his tone heavy with regret, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I messed up, badly. But please, can we talk? Just for a minute." Ms. Eve turned to face him, her expression unreadable. For several long seconds, she simply looked at him, studying his features as if trying to reconcile the man standing before her with the boy she had known years ago. Finally, she nodded stiffly. "Fine," she said, her voice steady, but tinged with weariness. "But not here. Inside." Without another word, she turned and walked toward her house, leaving the officers and the crowd behind. Reluctantly, Miller followed, his heart pounding in his chest. As they entered the living room, the same room where the photograph of young Greg hung proudly on the wall, an awkward silence settled between them. Ms. Eve sank onto the edge of her couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Miller lingered near the doorway, unsure of where to stand. "I owe you an explanation," Miller said eventually, breaking the quiet. "And an apology. What happened today? It shouldn't have. I let my assumptions get the better of me. And because of that, I hurt someone who didn't deserve it." His voice cracked slightly as he added, "Someone who mattered to me. A lot." Ms. Eve listened silently, her gaze fixed on the floor. After a pause, she raised her head and looked directly at him. "Gregory, when you were my student, I always told you that actions speak louder than words. Do you remember that lesson?" Miller nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, ma'am, I do." "Then prove it," she said firmly, though her voice softened as she continued. "Show me, and everyone else watching, that you've learned something from this, that you're willing to change." Her words hung in the air, simple yet powerful. Miller felt the weight of them pressing down on him, but also a flicker of hope. Maybe this didn't have to be the end of the story. Maybe it could be a beginning, a chance to make things right. "I will," he promised, his voice trembling but sincere. "I'll start by telling my superiors exactly what happened here. I won't hide behind excuses or try to shift the blame. And I'll push for changes within the department, training, accountability, anything that can prevent something like this from happening again." Ms. Eve studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Sensing that she needed space, Miller took a step back toward the door. Before leaving, he turned to her one last time. "Thank you for teaching me," he said softly. "Even now, you're still doing it." As the door closed behind him, Ms. Eve sat alone in her living room, surrounded by the familiar comforts of home. Outside, the crowd had begun to disperse, their anger giving way to whispered conversations about what had just transpired. Though the emotional toll of the day weighed heavily on her, Ms. Eve allowed herself a faint smile. Perhaps, she thought, some lessons never truly end, even for those who think they've grown too old to learn. As the officers stepped out of Ms. Eve's house, their faces were unreadable masks of frustration and unease. The search had turned up nothing. No stolen goods, no suspicious items, not even a trace of the suspect they'd been so sure was hiding there. Officer Miller carried the weight of the situation more heavily than his partner. His earlier confidence had crumbled into quiet uncertainty, though he tried to hide it. But as he glanced once more at the living room wall covered in photographs, something caught his eye, a face that stopped him cold. It was a faded picture, slightly yellowed with age, but unmistakable. A young boy stood proudly in front of a classroom chalkboard, holding up a spelling bee trophy. Beside him was Ms. Eve, her warm smile radiating pride. Officer Miller stared at the image, his breath catching in his throat. He recognized the boy immediately. It was him. That wide-eyed child grinning next to Ms. Eve was none other than Greg Miller himself. Memories flooded back like a tidal wave. He remembered sitting in her third-grade class, struggling to grasp multiplication tables while she patiently guided him through each problem. He recalled the way she encouraged him when he doubted himself, telling him he could achieve anything if he worked hard enough. And then there was the day she handed him that spelling bee trophy, patting him on the shoulder and saying, "You've earned this, Greg. Never forget how capable you are." Officer Miller felt his stomach churn with guilt. This wasn't just some random woman accused of a crime. This was someone who had shaped his life, someone who had believed in him when he needed it most. Now here he was, arresting her based on an unverified tip, treating her like a criminal without giving her the benefit of the doubt. The irony hit him like a punch to the gut. He turned to Officer Collins, his voice low but trembling. "Do you see this?" he asked, pointing at the photograph. When she didn't respond right away, he continued, "That's me. I was one of her students." Officer Collins squinted at the picture, then looked at Miller with wide eyes. "Are you serious?" Miller nodded, unable to tear his gaze away from the photo. "She was my teacher. She helped me become who I am today." His words trailed off, heavy with emotion. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The gravity of the situation settled over them both, pressing down like a leaden weight. Outside, the crowd noticed the shift in the officer's demeanor. They exchanged curious glances, wondering what had caused the sudden change. Someone called out, "What's going on now? Are you letting her go?" Reluctantly, Officer Miller walked toward the squad car, where Ms. Eve still sat, her head bowed and her hands still cuffed behind her back. Opening the door, he leaned down and met her tear-filled eyes. "Miss Thompson," he began hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper, "do you remember me?" Ms. Eve blinked, confused by the question. Then she looked closer at his face, recognition slowly dawning. Her lips parted in surprise. "Gregory Miller," she murmured, her voice soft, but filled with disbelief. "Is that really you?" Officer Miller nodded, shame burning in his chest. "Yes, ma'am. It's me." He swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. I'm sorry for what happened here. I made a mistake, a big one. I should have listened to you instead of jumping to conclusions." For a long moment, Ms. Eve simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. The pain and betrayal in her eyes cut deeper than any reprimand ever could. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "Gregory, I taught you better than this. I thought I raised you to treat people fairly, to give them respect until proven otherwise." Her words struck him like a hammer, leaving him speechless. Behind him, Officer Collins shifted uncomfortably, sensing the raw emotion in the air. The crowd outside fell silent, watching the exchange unfold with bated breath. With trembling hands, Officer Miller unlocked the handcuffs and gently removed them from Ms. Eve's wrists. "You're free to go, ma'am," he said quietly. "And I promise, I'll make this right." But as Ms. Eve stepped out of the squad car, rubbing her sore wrists, she knew that apologies wouldn't erase what had happened. The damage was done, and the scars would linger, for her and for the community that had witnessed it all. The squad car door slammed shut with a heavy thud, leaving Ms. Eve alone in the backseat. Her hands, still cuffed behind her, rested awkwardly against the cold leather. She stared out the window, her mind racing but unable to fully process what had just happened. The peaceful morning she'd begun only hours ago now felt like a distant memory. Outside, the scene was chaotic. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks and driveways, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Some shouted protests at the officers, while others simply stood frozen, watching as the woman they all respected was taken away. Officer Miller walked briskly toward the house, his jaw clenched tightly. Officer Collins followed close behind, glancing over her shoulder at the growing crowd. "This is getting out of hand," she muttered under her breath. But Miller didn't respond. His focus was fixed on the task ahead, searching the house for evidence that would justify their actions, or at least prove them right. Back inside the squad car, Ms. Eve's thoughts swirled. She replayed the events in her mind, trying to pinpoint where things had gone so horribly wrong. Hadn't she always been careful to live an honest life? Hadn't she dedicated herself to helping others, especially children? The accusations against her felt surreal, almost laughable if they weren't so devastating. How could anyone think she'd be involved in something as sinister as harboring a criminal? As the minutes ticked by, the officers began their search. They moved through her home with purpose, opening drawers, checking closets, and peering under furniture. Every creak of the floorboards echoed loudly in the otherwise quiet house. Despite the tension outside, the interior of Ms. Eve's home remained eerily calm, a stark contrast to the storm brewing beyond its walls. Meanwhile, the neighbors refused to disperse. Instead, they grew more vocal, their voices rising in unison as they demanded answers. Mrs. Jenkins stepped forward again, this time addressing Officer Collins directly. "You're making a huge mistake," she said firmly, pointing toward the squad car. "That woman has done more for this community than most people ever will. Whatever you think she's done, you're wrong." Officer Collins hesitated, glancing between Mrs. Jenkins and the house. Deep down, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something about this situation wasn't sitting right. But protocol dictated that they follow through on the tip, no matter how flimsy it seemed. So she turned away, avoiding eye contact with the angry crowd. Inside the house, Officer Miller paused when he entered the living room. His eyes scanned the space, taking in the framed photographs hanging neatly on one wall. There were pictures of smiling children, some holding trophies or certificates, others posing proudly beside Ms. Eve during school events. He recognized many of the faces. They belonged to kids who had grown up in the neighborhood, including some he'd known personally. For a brief moment, doubt flickered in his mind. Could someone who had touched so many lives really be guilty of such a crime? But before he could dwell on it further, his attention shifted to another part of the room. A small stack of papers sat on a side table near the couch. Hoping to find something incriminating, he flipped through them quickly. To his dismay, they turned out to be nothing more than old letters and teaching materials from Ms. Eve's classroom days. After nearly 30 minutes of searching, the officers found absolutely no evidence linking Ms. Eve to the burglary, or even suggesting that anyone else had been in her home recently. Frustration bubbled beneath the surface as they realized their lead had been a dead end. Still, pride and pressure pushed them forward. They couldn't admit defeat. Not yet. Outside, the crowd continued to grow restless. Someone suggested calling a local news station, while another neighbor filmed the scene with their phone. Word spread rapidly, turning what had started as a private ordeal into a public spectacle. Ms. Eve, still seated in the squad car, watched silently as her quiet life unraveled before her eyes. She felt a mix of emotions: humiliation, anger, sadness, but above all, she felt betrayed. Betrayed by the very system meant to protect her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officers emerged from the house empty-handed. Their expressions said it all. The search had yielded nothing. Reluctantly, they approached the squad car, exchanging uneasy glances. The weight of their mistake hung heavily in the air, though neither was ready to acknowledge it just yet. As they opened the car door to release Ms. Eve, they knew one thing for certain. The fallout from this day would ripple far beyond Maplewood. The moment Ms. Eve opened her door, the calmness of her morning vanished. Standing on her porch were two police officers, their faces serious and unreadable. Officer Greg Miller, a tall man with sharp features, stepped forward slightly, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. His partner, Officer Sarah Collins, stood a step behind him, glancing around the yard as if searching for something or someone. "Ma'am," Officer Miller began, his voice firm but not unkind, "we're investigating a burglary that occurred earlier today. We have reason to believe the suspect may be inside your home." Ms. Eve blinked, startled by the accusation. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. A burglary. In her neighborhood. And how could anyone think such a thing would happen in her house? She shook her head slowly, clutching the edge of her doorframe for support. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "but you must be mistaken. No one has been in my home except me this morning." Officer Miller frowned, clearly unconvinced. "We received information suggesting otherwise, ma'am. Can we come in and check?" Ms. Eve's heart sank. She felt a mix of confusion and indignation rising within her. How dare they accuse her like this without proof? This was her home, her sanctuary. "No," she replied firmly. straightening her posture despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "You can't just barge into my house because of some rumor. If you want to search it, you'll need a warrant." Her refusal seemed to irritate Officer Miller. He exchanged a quick glance with Officer Collins before turning back to Ms. Eve. "Ma'am, this is a serious matter. If you're hiding someone, it's only going to make things worse for you." "I'm not hiding anyone," Ms. Eve shot back, her voice rising now. "I've lived here for 40 years, and I've never had any trouble with the law. Why would I start now?" By this point, a small crowd had begun to gather outside. Neighbors who had noticed the commotion wandered over, curious about what was happening. Some recognized Ms. Eve immediately and called out to her, asking if she was okay. One woman, Mrs. Jenkins, stepped closer to the porch. "What's going on here?" she demanded, looking directly at the officers. "Ms. Eve doesn't deserve this kind of treatment." Officer Collins raised a hand, attempting to calm the growing tension. "Please, everyone, stay back. We're just doing our job." But the neighbors weren't backing down. Another man spoke up, his tone defiant. "Doing your job? By harassing an elderly woman? That's not right. You should be ashamed of yourselves." Ms. Eve appreciated the support, but the situation was spiraling out of control. She tried again to reason with the officers. "Look, I don't know anything about this burglary, and I certainly haven't done anything wrong. Please leave me alone." But Officer Miller wasn't listening anymore. Frustrated by her resistance, and perhaps by the crowd's disapproval, he made a decision that would haunt him later. "Ma'am, you're obstructing justice. I'm placing you under arrest." Before Ms. Eve could protest further, he reached for his handcuffs. Panic surged through her body as she realized what was happening. "Wait, you can't do this," she cried, taking a step back. But there was nowhere to go. The officers moved quickly, grabbing her arms and securing the cold metal cuffs around her wrists. Tears welled up in Ms. Eve's eyes as she was led toward the squad car. She stumbled slightly, her legs weak beneath her. The neighbors watched in stunned silence, their faces filled with disbelief and anger. Someone shouted, "This isn't right," while another muttered, "They'll regret this." As Ms. Eve sat in the back seat of the police car, staring out at the place she had called home for so many years, she couldn't believe how quickly everything had fallen apart. What had started as a quiet morning had turned into a nightmare, and she had no idea how it would end. The sun peeked over the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the quiet neighborhood. It was another peaceful morning in Maplewood, a small community where everyone knew each other by name. The streets were lined with modest houses, their front yards dotted with flower beds and neatly trimmed hedges. Among these homes stood Mrs. Evelyn Thompson's house, a cozy little cottage with a vibrant garden that always seemed to catch the eye of passers-by. Mrs. Thompson, or Ms. Eve, as the locals affectionately called her, had lived there for nearly 4 decades. At 72 years old, she moved slower than she used to, but her spirit remained as lively as ever. Every morning, rain or shine, she would step out onto her porch wearing her favorite wide-brimmed hat and kneel beside her flower beds. Her hands worked gently in the soil, pulling weeds and planting new seeds. To many, her garden wasn't just beautiful, it was a symbol of hope and care, much like Ms. Eve herself. But gardening wasn't the only thing that made Ms. Eve special. For over 30 years, she had been a beloved school teacher at the local elementary school. Even after retiring, she couldn't stay away from teaching altogether. She opened her home to children in the neighborhood who needed extra help with reading or math. Every weekday afternoon, kids could be found sitting around her dining table, books spread open as Ms. Eve patiently guided them through their lessons. Parents often said she had a gift, not just for teaching, but for making every child feel valued. On this particular morning, however, something felt different. As Ms. Eve watered her roses, she noticed unfamiliar police cars parked a few blocks down. Their flashing lights reflected off the windows of nearby homes, breaking the usual tranquility. She paused for a moment, shading her eyes with one hand to get a better look. What could they be doing here? Maplewood wasn't the kind of place where trouble happened. Still, she shrugged it off and went back to tending her plants. After all, what did police cars have to do with her? Unbeknownst to Ms. Eve, those officers weren't there for routine patrol. Earlier that morning, a burglary had taken place at a convenience store on the outskirts of town. A young man had been caught on camera fleeing the scene with stolen goods tucked under his arm. Witnesses reported seeing him run into the neighborhood, but no one could confirm exactly where he had gone. Desperate to track him down, the officers began questioning residents and searching properties. And then came the anonymous tip, a voice on the phone claiming the suspect had entered Ms. Eve's house. Ms. Eve, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding around her, finished watering her flowers and stepped inside to prepare breakfast. She hummed softly to herself, thinking about the tutoring session she had planned for later that day. Little did she know, her quiet morning was about to take a dramatic turn, one that would leave her shaken and the entire community outraged. As she sipped her tea, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed outside. Moments later, there was a sharp knock at her door. Curious, Ms. Eve set her cup down and walked toward the entrance. Peering through the peephole, she saw two uniformed officers standing on her porch. Something about their stern expressions made her heart skip a beat. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door, unsure of what awaited her on the other side.